There we go. Welcome to Pasifika Grand Rounds. We are so excited for our guest this evening, which Dr. Samoa is just hitting the highest of the high, celebrity level that I am in awe of all that he does. And we're just going to get started. Thank you for joining Pasifika Grand Rounds. We have Dr. Samoa and Dr. Patrick Thompson on. So we're going to get the show on the road, and we're going to have Dr. Samoa start us off and tell us what our topic is today.
Apologies. So, in honor of Pride Month, Pacifica Grand Rounds wanted to focus on our queer and trans Pacific Island communities. And so we were lucky enough to have somebody who's not only doing this research, but is doing such innovative work in regards to gathering information on this community, because this is a community that struggles with getting the data collected, analyzed, and presented in a manner that is reflective of their real lived experiences. So, with that, we are lucky enough to have Dr. Thompson join us to present on his research project entitled Manalangi. Um, and so I believe we have a couple of announcements just before we get to his presentation. So the disclaimer, with all our Pacifica Ground Rounds talk, the content of this talk and all of Pacifica Ground Rounds talk is provided for informational purposes only and does not intend to substitute professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. And then Naki, you're muted.
I'm new here. I'm new here. We formerly we formally recognize the original stewards of the lands our institutions stand on and their connection to it. The Gabrielino Tongva tribe are recognized as the original inhabitants of these lands, and their absence in the space speaks to the violent history they endured, including their forced relocation, enslavement, and exposure to old world diseases. This led to the rapid collapse of Tongva society ways and their eradication. We want to recognize our connection as the daughters and sons of Moana, the ocean that connects us, binds us to the work together for better days for all our people.
For those of you who are joining us and wish to get continuing medical education credit, please take down the attendance code. It's QAXRES and submit that code via email to cme@coh.org. We will also post this at the end of the presentation, but you can only get credit if you submit the attendance code during the live session. If you are having trouble with the code, you can also just email the cme@coh.org to try to obtain your credit.
Awesome. And the handsome, ever so celebrity, Afili, Dr. Patrick Thompson, is a senior lecturer in global studies, the director of Fofonga for Pacific Research Excellence, New Zealand's only Pacific research platform in a university. That gave me the chills. And senior research fellow in the Faculty of Medical Health Sciences in Waipapa, Taumata Brow. I hope I didn't smash that. The University of Auckland. Dr. Thompson is of Samoan descent from the villages of Vaimoso, Wainganga, and Moamoa in independent Samoa, and grew up in South Auckland, New Zealand. He is also the principal investigator for the Manalangi Project, the first Pacific Rainbow and Queer LGBTQIA plus MVP FAFF plus health and well-being project to be funded by the Health Research Council of New Zealand. He received his PhD from the University of Washington in 2018 and his master's degree in international studies from Seoul National University in South Korea. Dr. Thompson's research focuses on the well being of Pacific queer communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Pacific research, methodologies, and methods, as well as queer transnationalism. His PhD study was the first to use Pacific research methodologies in a Korean queer studies context, which was published in his book. From Sleepless in Seattle to Seoul U, Korean Gay Men and Cross Cultural Encounters in Transnational Times. As a scholar advocate, Dr. Thompson also works with FINE Pasifika Aotearoa Trust as a board member, New Zealand's only core funded Pacific queer serving organization, and is the Queer and LGBT plus studies collection editor for Lived Places Publishing, a startup publishing group in New York dedicated to creating space for marginalized voices in academic publishing, teaching, and learning. Oh my God. Welcome, Dr. Thompson, to Pacifica Grand Rounds. I'm all choked up over that. I'm so sorry.
I know. I'm so ready. The floor is yours, Patrick. Don't forget to unmute your mic.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Neki, and thank you, Dr. Samuel, for that beautiful introduction. O fatalo fatul pa ia man mamano le alfia el nenge afiafi. Warmest of Pacific greetings from Tamaki Makaurau, better known in English as Auckland, which is the largest city in New Zealand and one of the largest Polynesian cities in the world. I wanted to start by acknowledging all of you here today that are watching on the live stream, and thank you again, Dr. Samoa and team, for the invitation to address all of your learned colleagues in regards to the work that my team and I are engaging in here in New Zealand pertaining to health and wellbeing research with Pacific Rainbow Plus communities. So I guess we should get stuck into it. So if I can just move into our next slide, I'm unwilling. Oh, we have some disclosures here, Dr. Samoa, if you wanted to go through this. I do not have any relevant financial relationships.
Yeah, this is just yours. This is about your presentation.
Oh, okay. So the presentation, I'll just read this, and all comments will provide a balanced, non-promotional and evidence-based approach to all diagnostic, therapeutic, and or research-related content. I'll strive to do that as best as possible. Although I'm in New Zealand, I understand that there are things called state laws, like in California, and this cultural linguistic competency, CLC, and implicit bias. I'm not too sure what the background is to this, but I understand that we have here components that will be addressed in this presentation. The importance of understanding diverse cultural worldviews in healthcare. I think that's something that we've all come to understand as being really, really important to understanding how we provide healthcare to people of different cultural backgrounds. And that's something that's really relevant to us here in New Zealand. Also, the role that race and ethnicity biases in healthcare, how they manifest in self-reported discrimination and the impacts that that may have for well-being for queer Pacific Islanders in New Zealand. Hopefully I did that okay. We'll move on to the objectives. So what I'm hoping to share with you through my brief talk, hopefully. Number one, the first objective is to kind of give you a background and outline some of the work that's been done in queer NHPI health in places like New Zealand, where I am based, through the Manalangi project, where we have some of the largest and most established Pacific communities outside of the Pacific region. Although New Zealand is in the Pacific region, it's a bit of a confusing thing, currently reside. Number two, hopefully we can have the opportunity to discuss some of the ways learnings from the Manalangi project can be used to inform attempts to better understand challenges and opportunities in NHPI queer and trans Pacific Islanders. Throughout my presentation, hopefully I'll be able to give you background as to how Manalangi is being used in New Zealand for these purposes. Number three, identifying the value of Pacific-centered research methodologies and approaches in engaging with NHPI communities and public health research and intervention approaches. In New Zealand, we have been setting up communities, I guess, of Pacific researchers who are very much dedicated to forefronting Pacific knowledges and approaches in research that really reflect and are embedded within our cultures and cultural knowledge. And of course, number 4, discussing possible barriers and biases which may impact patient care. And I think this is probably relevant to many of you who are working in the medical profession. Examples of this can be in relation to race, ethnicity, language, gender identity and orientation, especially important at this time of year as it is Pride Month, I know, in the United States. Our Pride Month in New Zealand is actually in February because it's summer in February and we don't really like to go outside when it's cold, which it is right now in New Zealand. It's June, which is our first month of winter. And of course, age, socioeconomic status, attitude, feelings, and other characteristics. So some of these objectives for what my talk will go through. So if we can just go back to this slide here, this is where I want to start. So to start my presentation, and in acknowledging that many of you may not be familiar with the New Zealand context, if you are, because you might actually be watching from New Zealand, hi from down the road, please bear with me. But I did want to provide some quick grounding information that I hope will be able to help give some situating cadence to the work that we're doing. To begin with, New Zealand is actually well known for a country that is forgotten on world maps a lot of times. But don't forget, we do actually exist. We're a South Pacific nation located at the bottom southwest corner of the Polynesian Triangle. And one thing New Zealand is good at doing is marketing itself as a progressive, inclusive, and somewhat model of Indigenous relations. But for people who don't have the context or haven't been brought up here, people can often forget that New Zealand is a settler colonial state, much like the United States. So Maori, or the Indigenous people of this land, their settlement of these islands began around 1200 AD, with their ancestors likely to have come from what is known today as the Cook Islands. Today, Aotearoa New Zealand, or Aotearoa being the Maori name for these islands, which translates into the land of the long white cloud, is a country of about 5 million. 67% of our population identify as Pākehā, or the Maori word for Europeans or New Zealand Europeans. And according to the latest census information, Maori now make up about 20% of our entire population. Now, the impact of European settlement and colonization on the Indigenous Maori cannot be understated. Stemming from the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, or Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which was mistranslated, and has actually led to Maori being dispossessed of land, population collapse, having their language suppressed and culture undermined. In fact, in today's New Zealand, Maori have some of the worst health outcomes of any ethnic group. And sitting in company with Maori with these worst health outcomes are Pacific peoples. So if we go on to the next slide, in terms of the Pacific context, Pacific peoples make up about 9%. So this is according to our latest census drop, which just happened about 3 weeks ago. Pacific peoples make up about 9% of New Zealand's total population. So this makes us the largest Pacific diaspora community percentage-wise of any living in a settler colony in the world. Now, in terms of terminology, so in New Zealand, Māori are referred to as tangata whenua, or people of the land. Although Māori are Pacific peoples, this is where it gets a bit confusing. In New Zealand, we use tangata whenua or Māori for the Indigenous peoples of this land versus Pacific peoples, who are those of Pacific heritage from other Pacific islands outside Aotearoa, which is a distinction that only really happens in New Zealand. For while Pacific peoples and Māori are whanaunga or relatives, Pacific migration to New Zealand accelerated primarily following World War II, as New Zealand's settler colonial state needed cheap labor from the Pacific to fill its factory floors, abattoirs, seafood processing plants, freezing works, and this economic boom lasted about 2 decades. When New Zealand's economy contracted, this is where we witnessed what is perhaps the most traumatizing event in Pacific people's history in New Zealand, with the Dawn raids in the mid-1970s. So during this time, the New Zealand government were quite relaxed with visa requirements, but when the jobs dried up, Pacific people became the target of a racist government and police-led campaign, where police officers would raid the homes of Pacific families before dawn to identify overstayers that were deported, often immediately. without an opportunity to speak to family members. This was despite Pacific peoples making up less than a quarter of all expired visas. In fact, the majority of overstayers were from Europe, the United States, and South Africa. And if we move on to the next slide, despite this, Pacific peoples have demonstrated exceptional resilience in our adopted homeland. Considering New Zealand also had colonial ambitions in the Pacific, it once governed the independent state of Samoa and still claims sovereignty in some form over the Cook Islands and Niue, who are in free association with New Zealand, as well as Tokelau, which is a dependent territory of New Zealand. This history has meant that the Pacific flavor in New Zealand is predominantly Polynesian. Samoans make up nearly half of all Pacific peoples in New Zealand, followed by the Cook Islands and Tonga, as well as Niue. But about 10% of Pacific peoples here in New Zealand are actually multi-ethnic. And another important point to note is that in New Zealand, we actually talk about the impreciseness of the term Pacific. And in fact, the term that emerges from New Zealand educational scholarship in the 1980s is the term Pasifika, which is a term that acknowledges both the multiple generations that have developed here as Pacific, away from home, and that migration from the Pacific continues to occur. And another point to note from this context is how our imbrication in New Zealand into low-income jobs without any land wealth means that Pacific peoples have similar health outcomes to that of Māori, and well-being outcomes as well, which are tied to many social determinants of health. If we go to the next slide quickly, in terms of queer community, so New Zealand is a little bit different from other parts of the world. We use the term rainbow, and I decided to add plus. This is because Pacific queer folk here have been quite successful in lobbying for greater recognition of Indigenous Pacific terminologies for gender and sexuality divergence that sits outside the LGBTQIA+ acronym. Namely, Pacific Niuean scholar and activist Felicia Brown-Acton helped to coin the term MVP FAF+. That's the easiest way to say that, people. It's MVP FAF+, on behalf of 50 Pacific queer activists at the 2010 Asia Pacific Out Games to denote the Indigenous placement of queerness within Pacific cultures and histories. As such, we use the term Rainbow Plus now. So Rainbow Plus research in New Zealand is really a recent phenomenon. But the research that we do have paints quite a bleak picture in terms of Rainbow Plus or queer health and well-being. Much of this research has uncovered a lack of competency by healthcare providers, stigma still embedded within our systems for queer folk. And as is repeated the world over, Rainbow Plus individuals have poorer mental health outcomes, are more susceptible to addictions associated with various forms of trauma, and of course, higher suicidality. This research itself in New Zealand tends to be youth-focused and does poorly in disentangling other variables such as culture and ethnicity. While it's great we now have these bigger surveys, we're still missing an intersectionally informed approach, where a lot of these big surveys have actually missed or undercounted a lot of Pacific respondents. In other words, a lot of our communities and our peoples choose not to do these surveys. And if we move to the next slide, this is where Manalangi comes in. So while there's clear that there is a research gap that exists, I wanted to emphasize that Manalangi's inception is not just about addressing the research gap. Rather, it addresses the question of health and well-being of Pacific Rainbow Plus folk from the standpoint of mana. And its origins as a project can be tied to ngafa, or genealogy, as it's known in Samoan. Lived experience is really important here. So myself, as Whawhawhinge, I grew up in a household full of Whawhawhinge, and within a family who themselves would be considered probably unorthodox for a Samoan family. My mother in particular had many Whawhawhinge friends, and my house became a safe space for Whawhawhinge who had nowhere to go for various reasons. And one of those people I became connected to in my early years was none other than Felicia Brown-Acton, who was a mentor for me. When I returned to New Zealand in 2019, I came back with a strong sense that while Whawhawhinge are an integral part of Samoan culture and society, that our needs often came secondary to those of our heterosexual and heteronormative family and community members. You see, as a culture steeped in service, Whawhāwhine are often given credibility through performing service roles. And I knew this innately. So when I came back after finishing my PhD in 2019, I went straight to my whawhāwhine elders that I was connected to. And these connections, once again, were forged through my own genealogy. And it's important to note that for communities like ours that have experienced much marginalization, discrimination, and stigma, the ability to connect with our communities as a researcher will come down to not only your research goals, but your ability to understand your appropriateness to carry out this research. And this ngafa that I carried is what enabled me to speak to leaders in our communities who trusted me. And they told me that my hunches were right. From their experience as advocates for our communities for many years, they lamented the poor understanding of what we call gender liminality in Indigenous Pacific cultures that tended to permeate popular discourse and research in New Zealand on Pacific communities. Further that, not enough had been done to attune ourselves as a society to the diversity under the Pacific label. There was also a really strong lack of baseline statistics for Pacific Rainbow Plus folks in New Zealand due to undercounting in existing studies, as well as some of the complex social issues Pacific Rainbow Plus folk grapple with, which include religion and religiosity, which is often framed as an antithesis to Rainbow Plus existence, when in Pacific communities it's a bit more complex. And moving on to the next slide. So with our community leaders, I crafted a funding proposal for a project that I felt could help to deal with some of these gaps. Manalangi, the project, is funded by the Health Research Council of New Zealand, and I'm so grateful to the Health Research Council because they've just been a wonderful funding partner, allowing us to develop this research project in a way that could help us to create a safer and more responsive research space culturally for Pacific Rainbow Plus folk in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And also a project that would take a strengths-based approach that centered our people's voices in its design and delivery. The project unfolded in 3 phases. Our first was extensive community consultation in Talanoa, which would help us to design a national survey on issues that Pacific Rainbow Plus peoples felt were pertinent to their health and well-being. With additional individual talanoa, some people see them as similar to semi-structured interviews, to supplement the survey data with qualitative insights that were generated in a Pacific way. Now, this Pacific way leaned heavily on talanoa, which is a method and methodology that is in wide use in New Zealand among Pacific researchers, as it centers values such as relational connection building, empathy, and allows participants to drive narratives and research conversations while validating Pacific forms of connection as a site of knowledge generation. Now, Pacific scholars in New Zealand have spent many years developing literature on Talanoa and even in the region. So if you're interested in learning more about Talanoa, there's a lot in journal articles and popular press outlets in New Zealand that you can get that information from. So what is the Manalangi project? I've given you a lot of sort of background information. And what does Manalangi mean? Well, the full project name is Manalangi Aotearoa Pacific Rainbow LGBTQIA+, MVP5+, Health and Wellbeing Project. Now, that is a mouthful. So we refer to the project in short as Manalangi. Manalangi is actually a compound word that I coined in 2020 that has 2 component parts. Mana, innate spiritual essence and authority that is gifted at birth and enhanced over one's life, over one's lifetime, and langi, the Samoan word for the heavens or the skies. In this way, the name Manalangi brings into existence through its speaking the ethos of the project that is grounded in an acknowledgement of the mana of all Pacific peoples that should include Rainbow Plus peoples. And by focusing on the mana of people, it allows us to push past framings of marginalized communities as lacking mana and power, decentering the research as the locus of knowledge whose service should be to find ways to enhance our community's mana through research. In many ways, it is a bit of a political statement, speaking to our own communities about how we legitimate members of Pacific Rainbow communities in who they are. In other words, for us, being queer or Rainbow Plus are interconnected facets of our identities, and that our mana is neither diminished or denied by existing at this intersection. So a project with such powerful statements, moving on to the next slide, also needed a logo, right, that could speak to this ethos. And I also want to note that in Pacific spaces, I think branding and visual branding is really, really important, especially for researchers. This is because visual culture is an inescapable form of communication with our people, whose histories and lineages are represented often in visual form. That's why we took the Manalangi logo design quite seriously, and we commissioned a designer by the name of Tapuaki Helu, of Oddball Studios, who's also a member of the world-renowned Pacific queer collective FAFSWAG. We made sure that we work with as many Pacific queer folk in this project as possible to further embed it within community. Now, in terms of the logo itself, you'll see the manulua pattern, which is a representation of birds' wings, features very heavily in the logo. The manulua represents many things, including freedom and flight, a sentiment we wanted the project to look to, with the top tier pointing to the heavens or the langi, whilst the second tier represents the diversity that exists under the Manalangi banner. The top tier, being uniform in shape, also speaks to the fact that despite our massive diversity, we all share a common purpose, which is to enhance the mana of our Pacific Rainbow Plus peoples. The ombre color palette was intentional to speak to the interconnected nature of Pacific Rainbow Plus realities within our communities and our cultures. Whilst the rainbow flag places diversity next to each other in unity, we understood our communities' realities as not discrete identities, but intermixed and mingled realities. Now, with the approach and the branding sorted, we entered our community consultation phase in 2021. And to the next slide. With a clear sense of purpose and set of values that would define the way our research would unfold. This was a particularly challenging time for our communities, as New Zealand was plunged in and out of life-saving lockdowns as a result of COVID-19. In fact, Auckland, where I live, experienced the longest lockdown of any city in the world outside China during 2021 to 2022. Now, we've been told that we must have been the luckiest research team in the country. I prefer to say that we were probably sanctioned by the heavens, Manalangi, because while in-person research basically shut down during this time, we were able to complete an 8-city, 11-session community consultation round in person in between the lockdowns that restricted people's movements during this time. The Manalangi team, following the community consultations, actually developed our own model of community engagement that we'll be publishing very soon. And we titled it the HCLC model. It's a really, really simple model, which draws important insights from Indigenous research methodologies. Oh my gosh, can't speak English. As articulated by legendary Maori scholar Linda Tuiwai Smith, which acknowledges research as a dirty term, having been used against Indigenous peoples the world over to justify colonization. It also emanates from a wealth of Pacific Indigenous notions of knowledge generation that highlights the importance of relationality, connection, reciprocity, and power sharing, which is required to carry out research appropriately with our peoples. It also was unfolded through our own instincts as insiders to the community we were working with. As a model, its component parts are interrelated and mutually constitutive. It's, like I said before, relatively simple with just 4 interrelated component parts. HCLC stands for honor, connect, listen, and collaborate. We believe that these are all things that are intuitive to Indigenous and Pacific research methodologies. The first step in our model, is to honor communities, their ngafa, and their tautua. So, for example, like I was saying before, Felicia Brown-Acton, who's been a stalwart for Pacific Rainbow Plus communities across the world through a lifetime of service and advocacy, is someone I honor. Her work, as well as many others in community, have been the forerunner that's helped to pave the way for our project. It is actually part of our project's ngafa. Like I was saying before, my connection to Felicia began from when I was a child. She mentored me as a kid, but moreover, her tautua extends to my family. She crossed paths with my mother and has always honored my family in her service. As such, the honoring the Manalangi HCLC model is referring to is embedded within community praxis acknowledging and elevating community leaders in the research space as the true experts, as their knowledge is of invaluable lived experience and tautua or service, not merely text and articles, reports, and book publications. The second part of the model is to connect. Now, connect with community not as mere data points, but as real people with dreams, lived experience, concerns, and mana of their own. Community engagement for research cannot be the only purpose of connecting. Relationality is not akin to transactional engagement. It is a mutual responsibility and duty of care. So what this looked like for the Manalangi project was understanding that as researchers, we were not there to just extract information from our community for the purposes of survey design. Rather, we were there as fellow members of the community under research. And the primary goal would be to connect with community members as community members first. Part 3 of our model is to listen intently to community aspirations, not just challenges, especially for a community like ours who have experienced many marginalizations and stigma in their lives. Listen to community members as whānau or ainga or family was also our way of honoring the mana and ngafa connections that are inherent to Pacific peoples. Listening to community for us was not just a physical exercise wrapped up in research aims. It's an embodied praxis that commits researchers to leverage their privilege in the research space to act and support the aspirations of community. This also means being fully prepared for every consultation and having clear messages to be able to present your kaupapa or your topic or your cause to community in a way that shows you and their contribution in time and their lived experiences. And the fourth part of our model is collaborate. Collaborate with a community, in a way that allows their aspirations to be centered. As researchers, listen actively to identify additional parameters in which your project can platform community voices. Find ways to resource them and place community members as leaders of these additional collaborative works. So in practice, what does this look like? Well, for us, if we go to the next slide, in practice, this means the research was led by a member of our communities under study, and the Manalangi team are an all-Pacific, all-Māori team. This is important as our communities have been underserved and exploited by researchers in the past. Trust is an important tool for building connections, but also is needed in our space to rebuild faith amongst our communities. Moreover, working directly with community organizations was crucial, but not in a transactional way. Like, build real relationships with community organizations, support their causes, and connect with community groups as people, not as researchers who know all of the things. In practice, this also meant allowing our community members to use our platform for Pacific Rainbow Plus peoples who find little space in public and scholarly discourse. We were working with community members to also identify opportunities so that we could platform their voices and fold it into the work of the project. And we had to go and find ways to provision these ideas. I mean, it gave us a lot of extra work, but it was really worth it in the end, because if we go to the next slide, some of the outcomes of activating the HCLC model, well, obviously the first one, is building trust and legitimacy with the community members. But I can honestly say that it has grown the project far beyond what even I could have imagined, as well as being able to build those meaningful trust connections and respect amongst our own community. It's led to so many new projects spinning out from this one. This includes a TV series, which will be airing soon, a co-collecting project with our National Museum, and so collaborations with government departments, and we even have a book project in the works. In terms of the research, it also meant that we developed questions in the survey that did not align, and this is the controversial part, I guess, that did not align with some of the major surveys that we have in our country around health and well-being. I'll get to that a little bit later. But the questions we did include were guided by Pacific holistic models of health, such as the Whono Whale model, which is a really famous model here in New Zealand on Pacific health and well-being. All the questions that we included in the survey are what our communities wanted. And of that, we're actually really, really super proud, as it has allowed our community's priorities to be centered in the instrument. I had to understand that as a researcher, I was going to have to take on the battle with the respective disciplines, in academia, and advocate for our community's knowledges to be validated. That's not something that you should place the burden onto community. That's something you should be taking on as your burden as a researcher. Well, that's what we believe in the HCRC model anyway. What we also knew was that we had to shift our expectations. While we wanted to be able to focus on key areas of physical and mental health, testing validated tools and so forth, we realized that we actually needed to do some groundwork to lay that groundwork first, so our communities felt like that they could actually participate in the survey. And we needed to recapture the trust of our communities before delving deeper and harder into some of these trauma-laced areas. Thus, the survey became holistic, a survey marker that served as the marker of intention around developing future research, rather than try to be the be-all and end-all of research into the health of our communities. In other words, Manalangi would become a survey instrument that opened the door for more research into our community, rather than becoming the definitive instrument. Moreover, as requested by communities, we modified the survey instrument to include many opportunities through open text boxes for them to share the full richness of their experience. And I'm still on the previous slide. And another surprising outcome of the community engagement process was that communities made it clear, this was so surprising, but it was also extra work, that they understood who they were as Rainbow as part of their families, their churches and organizations that they were involved in. So they asked us to make sure we captured the experiences of their allies and family members too. So we designed another survey for our allies and family members. Crucially, by taking this intentional approach, the Manalangi team have been able to somewhat fly under the radar. This is a bit controversial. We've been able to broach some really sensitive conversations with conservative members of our communities with care. And as a result, we've tended to avoid, for the most part, the backlash that's befallen a lot of our sister organizations and movements. One of the things that has been an outcome of this is that we've had apologies delivered by high-profile Pacific politicians in New Zealand for their harmful comments made against our communities in the past. I mean, this is no mean feat. One of the narratives we had to challenge in New Zealand was the idea that Pacific communities were just too conservative to be able to support a project like our own. So now moving on to the next slide. For the final part of my presentation today, I wanted to go through the actual survey instrument itself and some of the results. So the data that I'm going to present now is on behalf of our research team, which includes Felicia Brown-Acton, Dr. Sam Manuela, who's a psychologist here at the University of Auckland, Professor Jemima Tiatiasiao, she's the Pro-Vice Chancellor Pacific at the University of Auckland, as well as Associate Professor Lara Greaves from the Victoria University of Wellington. We ran the survey from the end of February 2022 and stopped collecting responses in August 2022. So like I was saying before, we designed the survey in consultation with our community members, and we draw a lot of inspiration from the Whanofale model, the Pacific Islander Wellbeing Scale, the Identify, Counting Ourselves, and Honor Project Aotearoa surveys, which are all forerunners to our project. Which basically meant that we designed a new survey instrument that mapped well-being across a wider range of culturally appropriate areas that represent bowl or pillars of Pacific well-being. During the consultations, we were told by community members, like I was saying before, that they wanted to have their family members included. So we did that extra survey. In the end, we landed on about 750 responses. We were aiming for 500, with 482 identifying as Pacific Rainbow Plus or questioning. Now, that number doesn't seem like a big number in the grand scheme of things, but in New Zealand, this actually represents the largest sample ever collected by a survey that looks specifically at the experiences of Pacific Rainbow Plus peoples. We also held 62 talanoa with individuals across our country. These individual talanoa ranged from 45 minutes to about 3 hours in one case. This data will be coming out in a series of journal article publications over the next year. And now to the data itself. So the first set of questions the survey covered related to demographics. As you can see here, according to Manalangi data, Pacific Rainbow Plus peoples live all around Aotearoa, New Zealand, with the vast majority in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. Many of the people who took the survey were under the age of 40, so we've got quite a youthful sample, with Samoans being overrepresented in all the right ways, of course. But also what was interesting is that 43% of respondents were Pacific and Pakeha, right? Claimed Pacific and Pakeha or European heritage, with another 37% Pacific and Māori, right? So again, going back to what I was saying earlier in terms of the slipperiness of definitions, yes, Māori are Pacific, but again, Māori are tangata whenua. So we did not include Māori as Pacific in this specific sample. So the Manalangi sample was actually highly educated, with nearly half possessing a bachelor's degree or higher. This far surpasses the national Pacific average. Yet despite this, 10% of our sample was looking for paid work, nearly 3 times the national unemployment rate. Moreover, 5% of our sample indicated that they were intersex or carried a chromosomal variation, which again is higher than the estimated national rate of 1.5%. 6% said that they lived with a physical disability, and 10% indicated that they were neurodivergent. So, of course, our sample is, of course, a purposive sample. So whether this is representative or not, we can't say. But in terms of people who did take the survey, these are sort of the highlights of the demographic data that we were able to glean from the survey. In terms of the next section, we asked questions about physical health as well. So summary of some of the things that we found in the survey. We found that while most people were quite satisfied with their GP, 60%, so in New Zealand, GPs are general practitioners, so your family doctor. 60% of our respondents had experienced some form of discrimination when seeking out healthcare, which is concerning. Moreover, 76% were unaware of gender-affirming care, and 46% avoided seeing a doctor due to cost. 8.9% indicated that they were not enrolled with a primary healthcare provider, which again is much higher than our national average, which sits around 4 to 5%. In terms of mental health, we found that, sorry, next slide from Mulea. 80% of respondents over the preceding 4-week period felt at least a little isolated during this time, with nearly 30% indicating they found it hard to talk to someone when feeling sad or depressed. 64% of respondents were not aware of mental health services for Rainbow Plus or queer individuals, while 62% indicated that they had used a mental health service in the past 12 months. Of those who answered, about half were satisfied with the care they received. Now, this data becomes even more interesting when we look to other parts of the survey. So, for example, we asked questions related to support systems and family, which is on the next slide. In terms of support systems and family, when experiencing mental health distress, respondents were more likely to speak to a friend, a trusted family member, a partner, and no one before they would consider speaking to a health professional, such as their general practitioner or their family doctor. Most of the respondents had never engaged with a Rainbow provider before either. Which, you know, with those who had engaging mostly with 2 organizations, Rainbow Youth, which is our national sort of queer organization, and Pasifika Aotearoa Trust, which is our only Pacific serving queer core funded organization in New Zealand. In terms, on the next slide, so New Zealand has quite a lot of Pacific services in comparison to other countries around the world. So if we just, 18% of our respondents had used a Pacific service before, which is not a lot. For those who had, 63% of the responses related to feeling more comfortable around being Pacific as one of the reasons why they chose to use a Pacific service. Being with providers that understood their worldview was really important, and being free, so accessible, was also a main draw card. This was important because although it's not reported here, in Talanoa, many respondents actually said that cost was one of the main reasons they stopped seeking mental health care, despite acknowledging that they needed it. And our next slide from Onwole. 54%, so this is support systems and family again, 54% of our respondents said that their families were supportive of them being Rainbow Plus, which I still think is too low. And while nearly 90% had disclosed their identity to others, of those who had it, 36% indicated that they feared disownment, which is really sad. Another figure that was really surprising was 14% of our respondents indicated being subjected to conversion practices in the past, which has been outlawed in New Zealand. While 60% of responses around dependability suggested that our respondents' families were dependent on the respondent. So to me, this kind of affirms the importance of our families, but also indicates that our families are quite complicated places that require us to reflect upon how we are working with our young Pacific Rainbow Plus children, or young people as they develop and are raised in our worlds. And next slide from Mule. Now, religion. We had questions about religion, which is obviously a contentious issue in Pacific communities. And well, not surprising to me, 63% of respondents indicated that religion or spirituality was really important to them. And, this aligns very much with my lived experience as a Samoan, growing up Whawhawhingi. But also 61% indicated that religion made lives harder for them. And 21% said that they did not believe in organized religion, which is actually tracking similar to what's happening in wider New Zealand demographic patterns, where we're becoming less and less religious in New Zealand. Those who were or had were likely to be Catholic or were Catholic in the past. Again, not surprising. In terms of community and cultural identity, so we had questions around here. 18% of our respondents could speak their native language confidently, with another 24% unable to understand or speak their native Pacific language. Now, this is concerning because 92% of respondents indicated that they've considered their cultural identity important or very important, with 88% saying they were proud of being Pacific. Now, in New Zealand, there's much research that demonstrates the importance of cultural identity and security in one's cultural identity as a determinant of impacting overall well-being. Concerningly, 20% of respondents who answered the question said that they felt they had been excluded from a Pacific organization because of being rainbow, which is slightly higher than those who felt excluded by a rainbow organization for being Pacific. Nearly half of our respondents have never belonged to a rainbow organization, while the most common organizations community members belong to being Pacific-led dance and art collectives, with 49% indicating disconnection from mainstream rainbow spaces. Now, this tells me that we need more Pacific-led rainbow organizations and leadership. Now, in terms of the recommendations, I'm thrilled to say that the New Zealand's Ministry of Pacific People, Ministry of Health, or Te Whatu Ora, have been working with the Manalangi team to understand how best to approach, interventions in support of Pacific Rainbow in Aotearoa, following the recommendations that we offered in our community report. If we can just move to the next slide. Number one, our first recommendation was that Pacific Rainbow Plus specific support services need to exist across the country. 60% of respondents experiencing discrimination is also far too high. So we need to address discrimination in the healthcare system. We need more specific Rainbow Plus mental health services. They need to be cheap and they need to be connected to our communities. Next slide. We must work with our families and within the Pacific cultural context if we're going to be able to guide our young Rainbow Plus people in a way that keeps all aspects of their well-being at the heart of what we do. We cannot neglect the spiritual. We must work together with our churches to make places of worship more inclusive and safer. Next slide, please. We need to raise awareness within Pacific context around what Rainbow Plus specific issues are and support and what the support services are on offer. This includes also more Pacific Rainbow Plus research and researchers. We need more focus and research is needed in the employment space as well, considering the highly educated nature of many within our communities with lower employability rates. So to wrap up, I'd like to talk about Manalangi's impact. Just by existing and claiming space as a research platform, Manalangi has helped to drive conversations with government departments in New Zealand, which include Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Ministry for Pacific Peoples, who have created a new Pacific Rainbow Plus lead and its equity team, by the way, which is, I think, the first in the world. And we've witnessed across the life of the project mobilizing of new Pacific Rainbow Plus groups who are now using the Manalangi platform and data for advocacy in regions across the country. In the past, Auckland and Wellington have been the only places that have seen really big public groups advocate for Pacific Rainbow Plus. Now, what we're seeing, as mentioned earlier, what Manalangi has been able to do is it's helped to support these new community organizations develop in other cities around the country, which is just, wonderful to see. And we hope that the organizations grow and go from strength to strength to strength. We also have a TV series that's nearly ready. I'm hoping that the TV series will air in the next couple of months. Fingers crossed if we can get there. We're in the post-production phase. And like I mentioned before, we've got a co-collecting and exhibition upcoming with our National Museum in 2025. We're also awarded the University of Auckland's Research Excellence Award for our service to Pacific Rainbow communities. And really excitingly, the Health Research Council recently rewarded us with a new grant for 4 years that will allow us to take insights and models from the first project into a new project that will seek to address discrimination in healthcare for Pacific Rainbow Plus. But perhaps what I've been most proud of is how Manalangi has opened a world of possibilities for the next generation of Pacific Rainbow Plus knowledge generators. I'm currently the only openly queer Pacific and Whawhawhiwi researcher tenured in a New Zealand university who has this research focus. But in the next few years, this will no longer be the case. And I'm so happy that, it's lonely being the only one. And, I've taken on so many new graduate students of Pacific heritage and non-Pacific heritage too, who are pursuing higher study because they can see themselves reflected in the world of scholarship now that Manalangi has given them a platform to do so. And to finish off, I just wanted to share a couple of key links on the next slide. Here is the Manalangi website. This also houses our repository. So one of the things that we did at the beginning of the project, when we were doing our literature search, is I said to the team, I'm really tired of people saying that there's no Pacific Rainbow Plus research. I guess in journals, there may not be, perhaps there's not as many books that have been written by our people, but Pacific Rainbow individuals or Pacific queer folk are some of the most prolific creatives that exist in Pacific communities. And the work that they do is knowledge generation. So we're going to create a repository, and everything that we find in all sort of corners of the world that is related to Pacific Rainbow, we're going to put the repository there. And when people come to us and say, there's no Pacific Rainbow research, we can say, go to the repository. So that's there as well. But at the website, you'll also be able to find our community report, which has all the data that I shared with you, and also some of the caveats and things and advice on how you can use the data and what you can't use the data for. And of course, this is where we'll also be publishing all of our new journal articles. The TV series will go up there as well. And all the new journal articles that come out over the next few months will be open access and linked to, again, working within the ethos that this knowledge came from our community and our community should have access to it. And this is my email, patrick.thompson@auckland.ac.nz. If anyone wanted to chat some more about any of these things or perhaps connect, feel free to email me there. But thank you once again, Dr. Samoa, for the invitation. And also, big whakataitele lava Tinaki.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah. And some
awesome. Additional resources, Counting Ourselves Aotearoa New Zealand Trans and Non-Binary Survey. And then we'll post the link so that people can have access to it. Youth 19 Health and Wellbeing of Takatapui and Rainbow Young People. Did I say? Look at me.
Yeah, Takatapui. Yeah.
Yes. Identifysurvey.nz. We will post that. Bula Sautu, a window on quality 2021, Pacific Health in the year of COVID-19. And Manalangi Project Repository. And I'm excited to see all the stuff that goes in there. And thank you so much. I learned so much, but can I just tell you that 750 people to respond to a survey, that is amazing. That's awesome. And do you think you got that big of and to me, that's huge. That's like, that's big, huge. Do you think it's because, well, why do you think you got so many responses? And isn't that a lot?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, some of our other surveys will have much larger sample sizes.
Ah,
And you know, our survey was focused specifically on Pacific Rainbow peoples,
mm,
you know, individuals. So you're really talking about a minority within a minority.
right,
And
right.
so we were aiming for 500. We got 750. We almost got 500 Pacific Rainbow. But I think, you know, it was a great, for me, I thought it was a great response. And the reason why I think we got it was because we took that grassroots approach.
Yeah.
And we were really intentional and deliberate about the way that we went about the community consultation. Because what ended up happening, it wasn't just you know, getting advice on how we should refine the survey instrument. It was also getting people to actually become accustomed to the idea that this survey instrument was going to come out into the community. We had a very strong social media campaign, and the social media campaign was designed. I can't take any credit for that. That was all of our research assistants, all the young people got on board and designed that social media campaign. And I think that's why we got so much momentum and we got to fly under the radar, because
Mm,
while everybody else was fighting these really important, really important public discussions around legitimacy and so forth. You know, and one thing that we always said in the Manalangi project, when people would say, like, why don't you get involved in these political conversations? And I said, we've decided we're not going to get involved because we're not asking anybody for any of our rights. We have them, right?
yeah,
Like, we claim them. We're not asking that anyone. We're going to support everybody who's in that fight, but we have another purpose, and it's about trying to bring our community together and have our community members have their voices showcased. So for now, let's focus on this, but support everybody else who is in that public sort of space. And because of that, we were able to really, you know, develop this kind of slow and intentional momentum within Pacific communities. I think in New Zealand, anyway, there's kind of the sense that there's New Zealand society and then there's Pacific communities, and we kind of have our own borders. Sometimes we go outside into mainstream New Zealand society, but things that happen within Pacific communities are very much debated rigorously within our Pacific communities. Um, and that's where we wanted to stay. We wanted to stay in that space because we wanted us to actually kind of get our own house in order before we started to come out, if that makes sense.
yeah.
So that was a really long-winded way to respond to your question, Nikki.
Well, no, that's well. And another thing too, I think, like here in the States, recently there was a survey done where, you know, this city went out and tried to get questions or surveys on Pacific Islanders that lived out here, and they got a handful of responses. But and then they turned it around. A Pacific Islander nonprofit organization, Samoan Community Development Center, they took researchers, Pacific Islander faces,
Yeah,
and got them to knock on doors, and they like tripled the size of people
yeah,
that took the survey because we trust the people that look like it. You know,
yeah.
the people that look like you that you trust that you would take the survey. So I think that's amazing that you guys got.
But
I,
also, like, building on what you're saying, Nikki, it's not just about the face. It's also people know how to act,
yeah,
right? With another Pacific person. Like, you can't just go in there as like a, hi, I'm coming here to do a survey. You've got to be able to kind of like respectfully
right,
engage
right,
in our cultural way. And
right.
that's another reason why they tripled the number. Like, I'm
That's
sorry,
right.
I'm speculating, but for me,
Yeah.
that kind of just makes perfect sense.
No, definitely, definitely, because Tulo and all our cultural language and our body, our fasamoa, right? It's what we do when we go into a house. We take our shoes off. We Tulo when we walk in. So that made a big difference, and it's awesome to see these numbers, the numbers that you captured, and
Yeah, I
so
mean that's a it's a best practice. Um, so a best practice here in the States when your data is ridiculously difficult to get on Pacific Islanders, it's just a raw number. And we're often told that your sample size is too small, your population is too small. And so, during COVID, it became very problematic. And so the best practice for us was to build coalitions first,
Mm.
and then advocate, and then you pursue data, and it was a very successful model. Yours is a little different in that it was almost like community academic. The coalition started in there, but the foundation for that coalition, you built over time. I think that's the reason why people don't understand why it's a best practice. It's a best practice because these relationships that you need to be successful in data collection, we've cultivated over our entire lives, like our
Yeah.
decades and decades. I really loved what you said about how it doesn't diminish our mana to exist in that space. I thought that was just beautiful. And so when you get it, like as a queer trans-Pacific Islander, when you start to understand that, it becomes unbelievably empowering for you to now start to work with that lens, you know? And so one of the things I wanted to ask you though is I love the fact that you're able to now tell the story because that's what data is, right?
Mm,
Storytelling. Um, in the context that is true to our community's lived experience or the rainbow community's lived experience. Um, I think that's so important because people don't really understand that the state of our queer and trans Pacific Islander identities have been erased for centuries.
mm,
And you don't even have like where we were trying to investigate it, and even though the word fafafinge um, has been hijacked to mean male to female transgender, right? But you and I both identify as fafafinge, right? And so it confuses people to no end when they look at me and they're like, how are you a fafafinge? And I'm like, trust me, I am. But I think it's because, we've let them take our terms and bastardize it because that's what fits into the Western categories. Yeah,
mm.
like I think you said that earlier about it's the MFA
MVP Faf?
MVP FAF. So the
Yeah.
MVP FAF is a
Yeah.
perfect example of how our our Pacifica sexual orientation, gender identity, or our indigenous identities don't translate
Yeah.
very well. And so the one of the things that I love is that all the things that you collected pushes back against um, the things that are harmful from academia to our rainbow community.
Mm.
For instance, Naki, I don't know if you knew that there was this huge sort of narrative going around in academic world that Afafa Finge was a product of a family taking a boy and raising him as a girl
Oh, I did hear
because
that.
there wasn't enough boys. Maybe there's a couple individuals where that was true for, but I would say the overwhelming majority of Fafa Finge did not have that experience. And I think where those types of narratives become, because it was very the investigator from England got her grants by pushing this narrative. But what happens is then we become a myth. There's a myth of how these boys are taken and raised as girls because it's sensational. And you don't give equal rights to myths, right? Like they're not human. They're a fictional characterization of us, and so I love these. Anyway, Patrick, have you come across any of those sort of like narratives that you guys had to dispel in the Manalangi project?
Yeah, no, well, first of all, yes, absolutely. One of the things we've known for a long time is that Fafafinge and, part of the MVP FAF Plus sort of group doesn't align cleanly with LGBTQIA+. What I think is really interesting about a survey is two things. The first thing is that one of the things I didn't mention in the presentation is our community members said they didn't want a checkbox for gender and sexuality. And so, of course, me as a researcher was like, "Oh my gosh, what do you mean? Like, we need to check spots so that we can, like, how are we going to, like, code all of this data afterwards?"
Yeah.
But they were really adamant on this, and we got this from all the different cities that we went. They said that they were tired of having to check male, female, gender diverse, and especially or trans, non-binary, all of these sort of new terminologies that were coming out that were being used in our national surveys. So they said to us, "Can you just give us an open text box?" And again, my researcher brain was going, "Oh my gosh,
Oh my
how are
God.
we going to code all of this?" But what was really interesting is, like, I looked at some of the literature, and some of the research that had been done using open text box for that gender and sexuality question. And I think the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Survey did it. And what they found was that most people just wrote in male, female, boy or girl, or man, woman anyway. So it ended up being quite easy for them to code. There was only a few that kind of chose to give something different. We didn't get that. So, well, I thought, okay, well, let's do that anyway. That didn't happen for us. What we got was a whole range of different identities and different combinations of identity, because we asked the gender question separate from the sexuality question. And so a lot of people actually chose to write things like gay and whawhawhinie, right?
Right.
Or trans and whawhawhinie. One of my favorite responses, and one of my RAs always points this out every time we look at the data. She says, "Oh, this is my favorite response. It's like, goddess who loves all." We got.
Yeah.
So that data, we're still kind of working through at the moment. We've done some real basic analysis of that. And what we found is actually, I think almost 40% of our respondents either chose to use a Western terminology and a Pacific Indigenous terminology. And I think this happens precisely because of New Zealand's location, and because of our history, our people's history here in Aotearoa. Because even me, like, when I move in different spaces and I'm marked in different spaces by different labels. So when I'm in a Palangi space, I'm happy to call myself a gay man, because for Palangis to understand that kind of history and part of who I am, that's the word that they need to hear. But when I'm in a Samoan space, I will always preface with whawhawhinie. And I think this is the new frontier for Pacific research in general when it comes to identities, is how our movements around the world is engendering different expressions and articulations of who we are. And it's going to involve using some of the things that we've picked up and absorbed. Like, Samoans are the best remixers in the world. We remix everything that we come across, right? Everything. And so that's the exciting part of that. So instead of thinking about it in terms of always having to reclaim something that we've lost, I feel like it's reigniting something that's always been within. And what we've always been able, now what we're able to do is we're able to engage with what the world looks like today and create new lines of articulations. And that's what's exciting for me. Absolutely, LGBTQIA plus as a term has become the dominant term that we use to kind of medicalize almost people with, like, diverse gender and sexuality. But it doesn't have to be our future, right? We can think about how we move between these worlds. And this is where we're all sitting at. Like, how empowering and how just, like, profound for us as Pasifika Rainbow or Pacific Rainbow to be at the forefront of that.
Completely. Like, I think the reason why we use the term queer and trans-Pacific Islander is in honor of the the nebulousness of uh, sexual identity and gender identity and sexual orientation when it comes to Pacifica. It's weird that it's a difficult thing to explain in English, but
Yeah.
when it's easy for Fafafinga to know what the difference is when we talk to each other, in a cultural basis. And just for
Yeah.
Naki's like information, what Patrick is talking about, where you have an open checkbox, is a statistical nightmare. Like, the
Oh,
reason why the federal government doesn't do it in the U.S. is because statisticians would retire if they had to deal with the information you get with an open checkbox. One of the other things we also wanted to I think the reason we also use queer and trans-Pacific Islander with the U.S. Community was also the acknowledgement of, there's so many more identities we don't know.
good.
So the erasure with that comes with Hawaii, with the mahu and
Mm,
the fafapinge and even the fakaleiti, the
mm,
erasure there happens with the definition of the term. In places like Fiji, and in other parts of Southwest Oceania, the words have been completely erased. Like the terms have been erased. The Rainbow Pride Coalition, I think, is a group from Fiji that's trying to build a glossary to
mm,
reclaim a lot of those terms. And so a lot of these Pacific Island countries are at different states of what their queer and trans-Pacific Islander
mm,
identities are, because they're still in the point of reclaiming these identities. And so, like for instance, um, Santino Camacho, just he's going to publish a paper soon, but did his research on um, the identities in Guahan
Mm,
and some a little bit in Samoa, but mostly in the Guahan identities, and has like brought out a bunch of terms that have been they're post colonial terms. And so it's also sort of the understanding that indigenous doesn't mean antiquity.
mm,
Indigenous means it's agreed upon by the indigenous community that it affects or describes.
mhm,
Um, and so I love this idea that you guys are doing, and Patrick and Naki as well. Um, One of the things that I've noticed sort of in doing this work, and I have to tell you, Patrick, your the Manalangi survey and the Cutie Pie survey that we just did are almost like twins because we had the same, we have almost the same social indicators. We have the same level of depression and mental health. I think ours showed that we had 60% um, that needed mental health, but 85% of them, and our survey was a lot smaller, it was 255. 85% of those people who needed help avoided care.
mhm,
And so we face the same things. Um, One of the things I wanted to bring up was some of your findings in youth.
mm,
Well, not youth, but like environment, because your cohort was younger. We there was uh, a s- um, a publication from the Trevor Project that looked at Asian and Pacific Islander LGBTQ youth, and they had like really dismal numbers. Like 17% had access to community affirming spaces, but the numbers were really low. Like a really low percentage was out to parents regarding their identity. Another was had a low percentage that was out regarding their gender, and then there was a high percentage that experienced verbal and physical abuse and trauma. You know, and the reason why, like, I think it's important to sort of understand what that means, because you showed it too. Like, there's some environments that are not entirely welcoming, is
mm,
because um, and we don't know this number in Pacific Islanders, but across the board, um, with trans children, about 70 to 80% have tried to commit suicide
mm,
at least once. And what brings that number down is access to affirming spaces like supportive communities, being out to parents, having a supportive family. And that's where I kind of get to with the research we're doing, is that it's saving lives. Like it's the work that we have has the potential to protect our children um, from undue harm. You know,
mm,
and probably the other thing that I've come across that makes me really, and tell me if this is what you're kind of going through, because this is what I go through too, is that when people come to me and they're like, and they're Pacific people, and they're like, I don't understand why you focus. I don't understand why you have to be separate. Like, why do you have to kind of pursue like the You're trying to be, ele umalo fie ese, and I'm like, look, what you don't understand is our diving into this part of our identity is bringing us closer to our roots,
Mm,
right? Like the the defense of the binary to the point where like you're defending settler colonialism
mm,
is not only harmful to me, it's harmful to you. You know what I mean? Like
mm,
um that that whole trying to sort of adhere to sort of toxic masculinity, toxic femininity is a
mm,
means to uphold a way, a set of values that did not belong to us before contact.
mm.
Anyway, I can ramble all day. Pat. So Naki, the one thing Patrick and I can do if we get together is never stop talking. Patrick, the one thing Naki and I can do is never stop
never
talking
stop
to
talking.
each other.
Yeah,
So this is a very dangerous trio of people
yeah,
right now. Anyway,
yeah. Very
Well,
tell me your
if I
tell
can
me your
just
thoughts, Patrick and Naki.
if I can just circle back quickly to a couple of things that you mentioned. I'll call you Ray because I always call you Ray, but we're in a formal setting, so it should be Dr. Samoa. Dr.
No,
Samoa
you
Ray.
don't. No, it's not.
Um,
Please, I always tell people to call me Ray. Nobody listens.
well, I'll
Nobody
call you
will
Ray. I'll
nobody.
call you Ray because that's how I usually refer to you. But I wanted to circle back quickly to what you mentioned in terms of labels and the conceptualization is kind of the way that I think about it around our identities. And one thing that I think actually needs to happen is we who are in the research space and those of us who are adjacent to the research space, first of all, you need to get in the research space. Don't be adjacent anymore. We need more Pacific researchers to come into the space. We actually need to come and think about and conceptualize what we mean when we say fafafinga today, because people will say fafafinga translates into in the manner of a woman, and that's as far as it goes. And then we have some of the research by non-Samoan researchers that kind of theorize us in different traditions. Um, they use all of the different terminologies from their disciplines to classify us, which is why we got that research or those claims that, if a family didn't have girls, then a boy would be raised to be fafafingi to fit into like a familial structure, which was important to the continuation of Samoan families and so forth. And we know that those research traditions are probably not relevant today in terms of the interpretations of fafafingi. What we haven't had fafafingi come together to conceptualize fafafingi, and we need to do that. As a group of fafafingi, and everyone has to be involved in that. And because I always think about being fafafingi now being a transnational phenomenon, I don't see it as something that's just located in Samoa. Fafafingi exists all around the world because the Samoan nation is transnational, right? And that's just one aspect of it, because there are other islands in the Pacific, like you were saying, Ray, that are also kind of rebuilding and sort of remembering. I keep calling it remembering some of and re-articulating, the ways in which they want to express this innate sense of non-normativity when it comes to gender and sexuality, and how and where we are positioned as people who occupy that space within our cultures and within our families. Because that's the thing that Safa'a have always been really, really clear about. Fafafinga have a cultural and societal role in Samoa. That's why we don't exist outside, right? We are in Samoan culture. So don't forget that. But it's important enough for us to move forward and, move forward and start thinking about, like I was saying before, where we're going as a community and how we're thinking about what it means to be Samoan as a fafafinge in different locations around the world, still being connected back to our homelands and to our villages, to our culture, to our values, to our languages, and so I think that's the next step for us. We need to be part of that conversation, and we need to have everyone, I mean, Pamo is so different from Upolu now. But at the same time, there are still lots of different connections that happen between fafafinge, which are transnational in nature. So that's the first thing I wanted to circle back to. So while the other islands are doing different things. We need to be doing things too in Samoa, like Fafa, it's not settled, It's still an area of research that we haven't been involved in very much as Fafa Finge. So that would be really cool. I would really love to see
Yeah,
that
we
because
have to write our book. Remember, we have to.
I don't think we need any more work, Ray. I think we've got enough work. I think what we need is the next generation to be taking up these opportunities to lead these conversations. Like
Right.
starting to
Well, you
No.
have to give them. You have to give them text to contextualize. So it's like,
work.
okay, here's what we did. Take it,
Yeah,
run with it.
yeah,
But
absolutely.
don't you think it's getting better every generation? Do you feel like it's getting better? Because talking to um, someone who was going through their identity crisis in the early 80s compared to now, the
Yeah,
problems are completely different, right? Like, I feel like kids, youngsters these days, don't have to fight as much and have more resources that they're not using. Um, but it's a little bit not, and then maybe easier is not the word I'm looking for, but it could be a little easier for them to come out as it was back in the 70s and 80s, would you say? Or are we still fighting the same problem?
I think we're still fighting it. Like I think it's I think the opportunity is more visible.
Mm,
I think that's why it's important. Like Patrick said, like I think the conversation around Fafafinge um needs to sort of broaden into the community so that we're more visible.
mhm,
Because I will say, like, even though we have Fafafing in our family, it is still very difficult for and mind you, we're a very there's a big part of our family that's very progressive. Even
mm,
with that, um, it's difficult for kids to sort of come out and speak it, and I think a lot of it has to do with sort of long-standing traditions in regards to how youth communicate.
mhm,
Like there's I can't I don't know how much of it is traditional Samoan or how much of it is what we've adopted with the way religious communities treat their youth. You know that they're not they spoke there's only they speak when they're spoken to.
mm,
That type of mentality.
yeah.
And so I think we as a community still need to figure out like where that is because we also have very strong uh, roles in our family that speak to the otherwise, right? Like the taulelea.
Yeah.
Um, what's the female version of the taulelea? Um, Se wangalo foi. But the there's
the
not
other way.
not so much a the what
You mean the other way around? Do you mean the Manga?
Daomanga,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Right. And so, there's all these things that talk about like the importance of youth, the reverence of youth. But I think when our communication styles were translated, a lot of it was translated in the Western context of like this is hierarchy.
Mm,
This is, whereas, you know, knowing how like we organize naturally, I'm not sure that that's true.
mhm,
Yeah.
But leaves a
And
big place for us to go.
yeah.
yeah, and I also think back to your question, Aki, around whether it's easier. I think those are always really difficult questions to answer because it's quite a relative experience based on the context, right? So in the 70s and 80s, the context would be different. What may have been considered difficult in the 80s may not be difficult to do now in 2020s, but it doesn't mean it's any easier because there are new challenges and new things that people are kind of going through. So I think there's certainly in New Zealand, and this kind of ties back to the second point that I was supposed to finish, Ray, before when I circled back to that other point. See, this is what
Sorry.
happens when we go all over the place. Is that there's different sort of different lengths of traditions in terms of Pacific research in different locations, right? Right. So like, that question you were saying about like when people say, ele umalo lo fa este. I
Mhm.
think in New Zealand, there's been a long tradition of Pacific research. And so our project arrives as the first in this particular research space. But Pacific research and researchers and my elders in New Zealand have been fighting in the academic system for quite a few decades. And one of the things they've been fighting for is the opportunity for us to actually stand in our difference as Pacific peoples, to not always be considered that we only have one narrative that we need to be sort of engaging with, or every Pacific person has to be researched in one particular way. So we've had so many great scholars here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and that's why we've been spoiled with here in New Zealand. So by the time that we got to Manalangi, people were like, about time, right? It wasn't like, why are you doing the rainbow? We need the money to do research in this space, right? No, we had our community, our research community come out and say, I'm so happy someone's doing this research, Patrick. And so we got so much support from our colleagues, our Pacific colleagues here in New Zealand. And people were a little bit surprised. And this is what I've always been saying. I've been saying that as Pacific peoples, we are a collection of different ethnic groups, of different ideologies, of different beliefs. But, we are united in the purpose around advancing all of our people. But that doesn't mean that we all think the same and we all experience the world the same. And so we've been really lucky here in New Zealand because we have this long tradition of Pacific research, being led by Pacific researchers, that Manalangi arrived at a time where people are like, yes, we need a Pacific Rainbow Project. We need someone to be focusing on Pacific disability communities. We need somebody to be focusing on ethnic specific mental health data. So we've got now the Pacific label being disaggregated. People are now funding things that are specifically Tongan, specifically Samoan, specifically Cook Islander. And this is, I think, the difference in terms of the length of time that our researchers and the size. Like I was saying before, in the context, we're almost 10% of this whole country's population, which means it's slightly, I wouldn't say easier, but we have less barriers to being able to convince people that we need to have research money come into our communities than in the US. I experienced it in the US. I was like, whoa, okay. Okay, they really don't know where we are. Okay. So when I was going to school in the US, that was something that really surprised me, because in New Zealand, I always knew that our allies in New Zealand are great allies. And of course, we have people who are not, so supportive, but we work with that. We work with those challenges. But I think that's also a key difference, Ray, for doing this kind of research in New Zealand versus in America. Yeah.
And here's a question out of the chat for has the Manalangi survey sparked ideas of teaching how to be an ally to reach more conservative members of the community and or family members that might want to know how to show up?
Yeah, that's a great question, Carl. Interesting. Yeah, I'll tell you a little story. One of the first things that we got told by, I won't say who it was, but it was somebody who's quite well known in our community here in New Zealand. That they said to me, all right, now that you've done this community consultation work and you've got all of these Pacific family members coming along, if you are to succeed, you need to go into the churches. And of course, my first reaction was, okay, okay, I understand. Because you need to start convincing the churches, that it's important for them to support this kind of work. So this kind of relates to your question, Carl, around allyship. We haven't discussed specifically an approach, maybe a pedagogical approach, if we're going to get more scientific about it, around how we can teach someone to become an ally. What we've really tried to focus primarily on is getting people to understand the inherent connection to people within our community through the Pacific lens. Because in the Samoan context, you guys know this, it doesn't matter if you have seen this person for the very first time in your life, as soon as you establish some sort of ngafa connection, right, they become under your protection, because you understand the importance of that relationship that you both represent. And so the approach that we've been trying to take is getting people to understand that we, as Pacific Rainbow peoples, especially in the Samoan context, we're a part of your ngafa. And as soon as people understand that, that triggers a different set of responsibilities and thinking around how they engage with the individual. This is the theory that we've been operating with, and we're hoping to develop that more as a way to kind of to go to the churches eventually. I'm going to be giving a presentation to a church about Manalangi later on this year. I'm really excited about it. No, actually, I'm really excited about it because there are more progressive ministers now in the church who are wanting to understand how to protect our young people. One of the things New Zealand has, just like in Samoa and I guess also in the US, is we have a very high suicide rate. And one of the things our community members said is they didn't want questions about that in the survey because they felt like, you know, there was so much work and so much data already around the poor suicide statistics for Pacific young people in particular. They didn't want to relitigate that in the survey. And like I was saying in my presentation, we realized that the Manalangi survey itself would just open the door and we would need to do additional research in that space anyway. So let's just respect the community wishes and then think of a different way to approach that coming back in. But this all folds into that question around allyship. So we really want to center the Indigenous Samoan or Indigenous Pacific way of connecting with, you know, potential allies. And the thing is that you're not going to be able to convince everybody. But you've got to be prepared to identify when and where and how you can connect with those who will be on your side. And I think, you know, using that ngafa lens for me has been really successful because the connections that I had with individuals was not because of wasn't because of the research. It was because of a pre-existing family, village, community connection, and it was working and massaging those and leaning on those connections that helped to get those apologies. Like we had the Minister for Pacific People. So again, sorry, I'm carrying on. The Minister of Pacific People, so he came out quite aggressively against marriage equality when marriage equality was first passed in New Zealand back in 2013. And then we had some other very high profile Pacific politicians also espouse saying that this was going to be the end of our communities. It was going to bring on Sodom and Gomorrah, you know, all the stuff that we hear, which, you know, objectively true. But when I came back, you know, I went back to them. I said, excuse me, I have never, ever heard you say any of these things before. You know me, right? And we worked on that sort of kind of connection. And, you know, over time, they became more confident to be able to apologize. And they actually went on national television and apologized for what they did, which is pretty amazing. And I guess that's probably not a model. Sorry, Carl. But in response to how to bring, you know, teach other people to be an ally, I think we can all do it. And I think it's about leaning into our Indigenous wisdoms and, you know, our ways of knowing and being. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I love the ngafa lens, you know, like it's I mean, oftentimes what I tell people who are parents of queer and trans Pacific Islander children, like, you know, who are distressed and kind of worried about their future. And part of me kind of, as a parent, I can relate to that part of their anxiety. But oftentimes what you know, I tell them is basically what you said, Patrick, is that, you know, you can either sort of hide that part of themselves where they're, you know, going to have to find their own ways to cope, or you can embrace it and let them grow in and serve the community once they know who they are. You know what I
Mm.
mean? Like the what people don't understand when they use sort of the Western idea of um, gender identity and sexual orientation is that they completely cast out the individual. You know, like you may have a kid that's really good at math, but just happens to be a fafafinge. And when you tell that kid to hide the fact that they're a fafafinge, then what you're asking them is to hide their gifts as
Mm.
well. You know, instead of like embracing it and let them learn how to sort of, you know, use their natural talents to help the communities around them or him or her. Um, you're basically relinquishing them into sort of this isolation. And and like I think your study showed the same thing our study showed, is that when you do that, you increase the risk of high risk behavior. So not only do you sort of isolate them, you put them at risk. You put them in an area where now they're the things that would protect you, like looking forward to the next day, they don't have. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, thank
Huh.
you. Well, thank you both for this. I
Yeah.
mean, it was, I can't wait to learn more. I know there's a TV
Yeah.
series coming out. Series.
Oh, can you
Yeah,
guys put them on? Can you
Yes.
guys put them
Oh,
on Pacifica by Design
awesome.
too?
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. Let me
yeah.
play
What is
a
what's
little bit.
what's the There's a actor that's very, or the one that was the one that did drag. um I it was it just on a promo. There was uh say well,
Was
how
it
do
Buckley?
the the one that I look like out when they're
Buckley.
out of drag. Yeah, buckwheat.
Yeah, Edward
Yeah.
Cowley. Yeah.
Oh, there you go, Naki.
There
Bring
you go.
buckwheat to talk about
Need the connection. I'll need the
Yeah. Well, it's
do the
so
TV
Maggie and
promo.
Ray, the
Yeah.
TV series is kind of it's a docu kind of series, and it revisits about 5 decades of New Zealand history by reinserting the stories of Pacific Rainbow champions, which have been erased from our New Zealand historiography. And so this is all part, again, this came from community consultation. It was community ideas. And, like I was saying in our model, it's like, provision our community creatives to be involved and use your platform. So, of course, I got the funding for them. I went and applied for some New Zealand On Air funding for the TV series, because I said to them, I don't know how to make a TV series or documentary, but I can write a funding proposal. I'll do that.
need the funding, and I'll figure it out. Right? I will figure it out. What
I
is
was
it?
like, this is your idea. Yeah.
What is it called?
It's called Manalangi.
Oh,
Yeah.
so
So
awesome.
I'm actually going to go in and chat to our editor on Friday to see where we're sitting with the final post-production touches. So I'll definitely keep you updated.
Yes, please keep us updated. And
Yeah.
we'd like to come to New Zealand and watch it.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Samoa. Let's go to
Right?
Samoa.
I
Let's
can
go to New Zealand.
I can take some time off.
You're welcome anytime.
Yay.
Anytime at all. Yeah.
Oh, how wonderful. All
Dr.
right. It
Well, thank you
is,
so
yeah.
much. Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson, for your time, your knowledge. I've learned so much, and I'm still learning, and I look forward, and I'll be contacting you. Again. We ain't done. We ain't done. We're gonna have you on. We're gonna have you on FICA, of course, to come on and talk more and give and educate us more, but everyone. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. We know it's a day ahead, so it's probably we started on Wednesday. It's probably Thursday now because we took up so much of your time. But thank you so much for joining us this evening, Dr. Samoa. Thank you again. We are here every third Tuesday of the month. Look for us, Pasifika Grand Rounds.